The entire Moretti Mafia family had gathered for dinner. Capos, lieutenants, uncles, cousins, every powerful member of the family sat around the long table while their boss, Adriano Moretti, prepared to speak. Then the maid stepped forward, quiet, calm. She placed a cup of espresso beside him. "Your coffee, Don Adriano." He picked it up and took a sip. Then she said something that made the room go silent. "You added sugar." Adriano frowned. "So?" The maid slowly looked around the table at the entire Mafia family. Then she said the words that froze the room. "The real Adriano Moretti never drinks sugar in his espresso." Everyone stared at her like she had lost her mind. But she didn't stop. She pointed straight at the man sitting at the head of the table. "He's not your boss." The room erupted, and the maid said the one sentence that shocked the entire Mafia family. "He's an impostor, and I can prove it." To understand how a maid could accuse the most powerful Mafia boss in New York of being an impostor, you have to go back to the night Adriano Moretti was born. The Moretti family had ruled their criminal empire in New York for generations. Their mansion stood like a fortress on the outskirts of the city, guarded by men who would kill without hesitation to protect the family. But inside that mansion, a secret had been buried for over 30 years. On the night Adriano's mother went into labor, 2 babies were born. Not 1, 2, identical twin boys. The midwife who delivered them quickly wrapped the newborns and handed them to the exhausted mother. For a brief moment, the room was filled with joy. Then the midwife returned with terrible news. One of the babies had died. The Moretti family mourned the loss and buried the child without ever asking too many questions. What they didn't know was that the baby had never died. He had been paid for. The midwife had accepted a fortune from another powerful Italian-American family, the Balotti family, who at the time were the Moretti's closest business partners in New York. The Balotti wife had never been able to have children, but that wasn't the only reason she wanted the baby. She wanted leverage, a secret weapon. So one of the Moretti twins was secretly taken that night and raised as a Balotti. For years, the 2 families worked side by side, building power in New York's underworld, until the day the truth began to surface. When the Morettis discovered the child had been stolen, the alliance shattered. Friends became enemies, war replaced partnership, and the stolen twin was taken far away, raised abroad, and taught one thing his entire life, that the Moretti family were his enemies. Years later, that stolen son would return to New York with one mission: destroy the Moretti Empire, erase his twin brother forever, and take the throne he believed belonged to him. But there was one person inside the Moretti mansion who noticed something no one else did. A woman who had grown up inside those walls, a woman who knew the real Adriano Moretti better than anyone: the Maid, Vicky Johnson. Welcome to Afro-Korean Mafia Love Thrillers, the home of dark romance, brutal betrayals, forbidden passion, and revenge that cuts deep. Here, we explore deep, emotional, and thrilling love stories between African women and Korean men. Stories filled with passion, culture clash, forbidden love, secrets, sacrifice, and destiny. From tender romance to intense drama, from heartbreak to healing, every story pulls you into a world where love crosses borders and challenges expectations. If you love stories where powerful men fall for the one woman they were never supposed to love, and vice versa, where enemies become lovers, and where every choice has a deadly consequence, then you're in the right place. Don't forget to subscribe to this thrilling channel, like, and share this video because every week we bring you heart-pounding mafia love stories that will keep you hooked till the very last word. Now sit back because this story is about to blow your mind. Now, let's get back to our story. The night Adriano Moretti returned to the mansion, the entire household breathed a sigh of relief. For 3 days, the powerful head of the Moretti family had vanished after an attack on one of his downtown operations. His convoy had been ambushed, his security scattered, and rumors had spread quickly through New York's underworld that the legendary mafia boss might finally be dead. Inside the Moretti mansion, tension had hung over every room like a storm waiting to break. Then, just after sunset on the 3rd day, the gates opened. A black car rolled slowly into the courtyard. Vicky Johnson was standing near the kitchen entrance when she saw it. For a moment, she froze. The driver stepped out first, then moved quickly to open the back door. And Adriano Moretti stepped out. A wave of relief rippled through the guards and staff nearby. Some of the soldiers exchanged quick glances, others nodded respectfully as their boss walked past them without a word. Adriano looked exactly the same as he always did. Tall, composed, his dark suit perfectly fitted, his sharp features unreadable as his eyes swept across the courtyard. To everyone else, it was simple. Their boss had survived another attempt on his life. But Vicky didn't move. She had grown up inside these walls. Her mother had worked for the Moretti family when she was still a little girl, and Vicky had spent most of her childhood running through these halls alongside the young Adriano long before he became the feared man who now ruled the family. She knew him better than most people in this mansion, and something about the way he walked through the courtyard made a quiet unease settle in her chest. Adriano had always moved with a calm confidence, like a man who owned every room he stepped into. Tonight, his movements were slightly different, subtle, almost unnoticeable, but Vicky noticed. His shoulders were tighter. His eyes moved too quickly, scanning the surroundings, like a man studying a place he should already know. She told herself she was imagining things. After all, the man had just survived an attack. Anyone would look a little different after something like that. Still, as Adriano passed by her, his gaze briefly met hers. For a second, something flickered in his expression. Confusion. It was gone almost immediately, but it was enough to make Vicky's heart tighten. The real Adriano Moretti had known her since she was a child. He had watched her grow up in this house. And yet, the look he just gave her felt strangely unfamiliar, like he was looking at someone he had never seen before. Vicky forced a polite smile and lowered her eyes the way the staff always did when the boss walked past. But as Adriano continued toward the front doors of the mansion, a thought crept quietly into her mind. Maybe it was the stress. Maybe the attack had shaken him more than anyone realized. Or maybe something about Adriano Moretti had changed, and Vicky Johnson was the only person in the entire mansion who seemed to notice it. Vicky had lived inside the Moretti mansion for as long as she could remember, long before the guards at the gates carried rifles, long before the city whispered Adriano Moretti's name with fear and respect. Back then, the mansion had felt different, louder, warmer. Her mother had worked for the Moretti family as one of the housekeepers. She used to bring Vicky with her when she was still a little girl, too young to be left alone anywhere else. That was how Vicky first met Adriano. He hadn't been Don Adriano then. He had just been a boy. The son of one of the most powerful families in New York, yes, but still just a boy who hated his tutors, sneaked out of the study rooms, and preferred running through the gardens instead of learning about business and loyalty. Vicky had been the only child in the mansion who wasn't part of the Moretti bloodline. At first, she thought the young heir would ignore her. Instead, Adriano had handed her a wooden toy car one afternoon and said, "You can play too." That was how it started. Years passed inside those walls. The Moretti mansion was enormous. Long marble corridors, high windows, rooms that echoed with the voices of powerful men discussing things children were never supposed to hear. But Vicky and Adriano had their own small world within it. They hid in the gardens when the adults were busy. They raced down the long hallways until one of the guards told them to stop. Sometimes they sat on the wide stone steps behind the house, watching the city lights flicker far away in the distance. Adriano always talked more than he should have. Even back then, he carried the weight of being the Moretti heir. "Everyone expects me to be like my father one day," he once told her when they were barely teenagers. Vicky had shrugged. "Maybe you will be." Adriano had laughed quietly. "Maybe, but when that day comes, nobody will remember I was just a kid once." He had always been different with her. Not the future mafia boss, just Adriano. The years eventually changed everything. Vicky grew older, and so did the responsibilities in the mansion. Her mother continued working there, and eventually Vicky did too. By the time Adriano took control of the family after his father's death, the world outside the mansion had already begun to fear him. But inside the house, he still remembered her. Sometimes when he passed through the kitchen, he would stop for a moment and ask how her mother was doing. Sometimes he would bring his espresso cup and lean casually against the counter, talking quietly while the rest of the family argued in the dining room. And sometimes, late at night, when the mansion had fallen silent, he would sit across from her at the small back terrace and talk about things he never told anyone else. To everyone else, Vicky Johnson was just a maid, but Adriano had known her since childhood, which is why the way he looked at her earlier in the courtyard kept echoing in her mind, because the man who returned to the mansion tonight had looked at her like a stranger. The night the future of the Moretti family changed forever began quietly. Outside, rain fell steadily over the city, tapping against the tall windows of the Moretti mansion. Inside, the house was filled with tension as doctors and servants moved quickly through the upstairs hallway. Donna Moretti was in labor. In the large bedroom at the end of the hall, the midwife worked carefully beside the doctor, while Adriana's father paced the floor like a man who had never felt more powerless in his life. The Moretti family had ruled New York's underworld for decades, but at that moment, none of that power mattered. All that mattered was the child about to be born. After hours of labor, the first cry finally echoed through the room. A baby boy. Strong. Healthy. The doctor smiled with relief as he handed the newborn to the exhausted mother. But the night wasn't over yet. Moments later, the midwife froze. "There's another one," she said quietly. The room went silent. Another cry soon followed. A second baby. Identical. 2 sons had been born into the Moretti family. For a moment, joy filled the room. Adriano's father laughed in disbelief, staring at the 2 tiny boys who would one day inherit everything he had built. But standing near the end of the bed, the midwife felt something very different. Fear. Because earlier that night, before the labor had begun, she had been visited. A woman had come quietly through the servants' entrance of the mansion. Elegant, calm, determined. The wife of Don Carlo Balotti. At the time, the Balotti family were the Moretti's closest allies in business. The 2 families had built their power together in New York. But that night, the Balotti wife had come with something else. A suitcase full of money. And a request. She had never been able to have children, and when she heard the Moretti family was expecting a baby, she saw an opportunity she had waited for her entire life. The midwife had refused at first, until the Balotti woman opened the suitcase. The amount of money inside could change the rest of her life. All she had to do was lie. Now, standing in the room with the two newborn boys crying beside their mother, the midwife knew the moment had come. Her hands trembled slightly as she lifted the second child. Minutes later, she returned to the room where Adriano's father was waiting anxiously. Her voice was quiet. "I'm sorry," she said. "One of the babies didn't survive." The room fell silent. The Moretti family believed her, and somewhere in the mansion that night, hidden from everyone else, the balotti wife held the stolen child in her arms. A child who would grow up believing he was a balotti. A child who would one day return to destroy the brother he never knew he had. For years after that night, the secret remained buried. Inside the Moretti mansion, the surviving child, Adriano, grew up surrounded by loyalty, power, and the quiet expectations that one day he would lead the family empire. Across the city, in another grand house that few people connected to the Morettis, another boy was growing up as well. The Balotti family named him Luca. To the outside world, he was simply the long-awaited son of Don Carlo Balotti and his wife. No one questioned it. After all, the Balottis were powerful, wealthy, and respected partners of the Moretti family at the time. Business between the two families thrived for years. They shared territory, investments, political connections. To outsiders, they looked like two sides of the same empire, but secrets have a way of refusing to stay buried forever. The first cracks appeared when Adriano was still a teenager. It began with something small. An old servant who had worked in the mansion the night Adriano was born began asking questions about the midwife. Records that should have existed had quietly disappeared. Dates in the hospital documents didn't match. At first, the Moretti family dismissed it, until one of the family lawyers uncovered a payment made to the midwife the same night the twins had been born, a payment that came from an account connected to the Balotti family. That was when suspicion turned into something far more dangerous. Don Moretti confronted Don Carlo Balotti personally. The meeting between the two families was supposed to be private, but by the time it ended, every powerful man in New York's underworld could feel the shift in the air. The Morettis accused the Balottis of stealing one of their sons. The Balottis denied everything. Voices were raised, threats were exchanged, years of trust collapsed in a single night. From that moment on, the partnership between the families was finished. Friends became enemies. Territories were divided. Deals were broken. Alliances across the city were forced to choose sides. And in the shadows of that growing war, one decision changed the course of both families forever. The Balottis sent Luca away, far away. Officially, he was going abroad to study business, but the real reason was far more dangerous. The Balottis knew that if the truth ever surfaced, the Morettis would come for the boy. So Luca was raised overseas, far from New York, far from the war between the two families, raised with one story repeated to him again and again, that the Moretti family had betrayed them, that they had tried to destroy the Balottis, and that one day Luca would return to take back what rightfully belonged to his family. Because what the Moretti family didn't know was that the man they were about to welcome back into the mansion had already ordered Adriano Moretti's death. Years passed, and the war between the Moretti and Balotti families slowly reshaped the balance of power in New York's underworld. Deals that once belonged to both families were now fiercely contested. Old alliances fractured, and the city learned quickly that when powerful families turned against each other, the consequences were never quiet. But far from the streets of New York, another story was unfolding. Luca Balotti grew up in cities far away from the empire he had been born into, first in London, then in Milan, later in private schools in Switzerland where money and influence shaped the futures of powerful men's sons. Officially, he was the heir of the Balotti family business, the boy who would one day reclaim what the Morettis had supposedly stolen from his family. From the time he was old enough to understand words like loyalty and betrayal, one story was repeated to him over and over again. The Moretti family were enemies. They were ruthless men who had turned against the Balottis and tried to destroy them, according to the story Luca grew up hearing. The Morettis had stolen business deals, territory, and power that once belonged to his family. His foster father, Don Carlo Balotti, made the lesson clear. Never forget who your enemies are, he told Luca during one of their last meetings before the older man's health began to fail. Luca listened carefully. He had his father's sharp eyes and calm demeanor, but beneath that calm was a quiet anger that had been carefully shaped over the years. By the time Don Carlo died, Luca had already accepted the responsibility placed on him. Revenge. The Balotti family might have lost their influence in New York, but Luca had spent years building something of his own overseas. Quiet connections, loyal men, resources that didn't belong to either family's old networks. And when he finally stepped off the plane in New York years later, the city that had once been the center of his empire felt strangely familiar, almost like he had belonged there once. But Luca pushed that thought away. The mission was clear. The Moretti Empire was still standing, and at the top of it was the man that he had been taught to hate his entire life, Adriano Moretti. What Luca didn't know, what no one had ever told him, was the truth buried beneath the lies he had grown up with, that Adriano Moretti wasn't just his enemy, he was his brother. The morning after Adriano's return, the mansion slowly returned to its usual rhythm. Guards rotated shifts at the gates. Servants moved through the hallways, carrying trays and linens. In the large office overlooking the gardens, capos from across the city began arriving one by one to meet with their boss. To everyone else, things felt normal again. The Moretti Empire had survived another threat. But in the kitchen, Vicky Johnson couldn't shake the quiet unease that had followed her since the moment Adriano walked back through the gates. She was preparing the morning coffee tray when she heard footsteps enter the room behind her. She didn't need to turn around to know who it was. Adriano had a habit of coming to the kitchen himself when he wanted his espresso early in the morning, before the rest of the family gathered. She set the cup down on the tray and turned. "Good morning, Adriano," she said softly. For a brief moment, he seemed surprised that she addressed him so casually. Then the expression disappeared and he nodded. "Morning." Vicky slid the cup of espresso toward him across the counter. For years, the routine had always been the same. Adriano would take the cup, drink it black, and lean against the counter while they exchanged a few quiet words before the house woke up. But today, something different happened. He picked up the cup. Then his eyes moved to the small glass jar beside it. The sugar. Without hesitation, he opened the jar and poured 2 spoons into the espresso. Vicky froze. For a moment, she thought she had imagined it. But then he stirred the coffee slowly and took a sip. Her stomach tightened. Adriano Moretti hated sugar in his espresso. He always had. Even as a teenager, he used to laugh whenever someone tried to offer it to him. Espresso isn't supposed to be sweet. If you need sugar, you're drinking the wrong coffee. Vicky watched him carefully as he set the cup down on the counter. He didn't notice her staring. Or maybe he did. But he didn't react. Instead, he simply finished the coffee and walked out of the kitchen without another word. Vicky remained standing there long after he left. Her mind raced. Maybe the attack had changed his taste. Maybe stress did strange things to people. But the uneasy feeling from the night before returned stronger than ever, because the man she had grown up with would never have added sugar to his espresso. And when Vicky saw him order his espresso later that afternoon in front of the capos, she realized something terrifying. He asked for sugar again. And in that moment, Vicky Johnson understood something no one else in the mansion had begun to suspect. The man sitting in Adriano Moretti's chair might look exactly like him, but something about him wasn't right. The image of Adriano stirring sugar into his espresso refused to leave Vicky's mind. All afternoon, she moved through her chores inside the mansion, but her thoughts kept returning to that moment in the kitchen. 2 spoons of sugar. Adriano Moretti had always hated sugar in his coffee. It was such a small thing, something no one else in the mansion would ever think about. To the rest of the family, the boss changing his taste in coffee would mean nothing. But Vicky had known Adriano long before he became the man who ruled New York's underworld. She knew the little things, and the little things were beginning to feel wrong. Late that evening, the mansion had grown quiet again. Most of the family had retired to their rooms while the guards outside rotated shifts beneath the dim lights of the courtyard. Vicky stepped onto the back terrace with a tray of empty cups and paused for a moment, staring out at the dark garden beyond the stone railing. The same place where she and Adriano had once spent hours as children. A memory slowly surfaced in her mind. She could see it clearly. They had been no older than 10 or 11. Adriano had been hiding behind the tall hedges after escaping another long afternoon of tutoring, and Vicky had followed him outside with 2 small cups of coffee she had secretly taken from the kitchen. Adriano had taken 1 sip and immediately made a face. "You put sugar in this," he had said, squinting at her like she had committed a terrible crime. Vicky had laughed. "It tastes better." "No," Adriano had insisted, pushing the cup back toward her. "Espresso is supposed to be bitter." She remembered the way he leaned back against the stone railing afterward, staring out at the city lights. "People change when they grow up," he had said quietly, far more serious than a boy his age should have been. "Even me." Vicky had shrugged at the time. "Maybe." Adriano had shaken his head slowly. "Not everything changes." Then he had said something she had never forgotten. "If one day you ever think I've changed too much," he told her, "remind me about this night." Vicky closed her eyes now as the memory settled over her. Because the real Adriano Moretti had once told her something no impostor could ever fake. And the man walking through the halls of the mansion right now had already failed the test. The dining hall of the Moretti mansion was rarely quiet when the entire family gathered. That night, the long oak table stretched beneath the glow of the chandeliers, surrounded by powerful men and women whose decisions shaped large parts of New York's underworld. Capos from different territories sat beside family members who had spent their lives inside the business. Wine glasses clinked softly, conversations moved in low, controlled tones. At the head of the table sat Adriano Moretti, or at least the man everyone believed was Adriano. Vicky moved quietly between the chairs, placing plates and refilling glasses the way she had done hundreds of times before. To everyone else in the room, she was invisible, a maid doing her job. But tonight, her mind was anything but calm. She watched him carefully, every movement, every gesture, the way he spoke, the way he held his glass, the way his eyes moved around the room as if he were constantly measuring the reactions of the people around him. Something about him still felt wrong. Across the table, one of the Moretti uncles leaned forward. "The attack last week," he said, swirling wine in his glass. "You're sure it wasn't the Balottis?" The name hung in the air like a shadow. The Balotti family had been enemies for years now, old allies turned bitter rivals after the alliance between the families collapsed decades earlier. The man at the head of the table leaned back calmly. "No, the Balottis are finished. They don't have the strength for something like that anymore." Several of the capos nodded. The conversation moved on, shifting toward business, territory disputes, and shipments arriving at the harbor. But Vicky barely heard any of it, because every now and then she caught him glancing around the room again, not like a man sitting in his own home, more like someone studying a place he had only recently arrived in. Her hands tightened slightly around the coffee tray she carried. At the end of the meal, she stepped forward to place the espresso cups in front of the family members one by one. The final cup was for Adriano. She set it gently beside him. For a moment, he didn't touch it. Then his hand reached for the small sugar bowl placed near the center of the table. Vicky's heart began to beat faster. She watched him scoop sugar into the espresso again. One spoon, then another. Around the table, no one noticed. No one except her. And as the conversation continued, the quiet tension inside Vicky grew stronger with every passing second. Because the dinner unfolding around that table was supposed to be just another meeting of the Moretti family. But deep down, she could feel it. Something was about to happen that would change everything. The room quieted as the espresso cups were passed around the table. Vicky moved slowly from one seat to the next, placing the small porcelain cups in front of the family members. No one paid much attention to her. To them, she was simply part of the household, someone who had always been there in the background. But tonight, every step she took felt heavier. Her heart was pounding in her chest. When she finally reached the head of the table, she placed the last cup in front of the man everyone believed was Adriano Moretti. He barely looked at her. His attention was still on the conversation unfolding around the table. "Tomorrow morning we'll meet with the Brooklyn crew," one of the capos was saying. "They've been asking about the shipment coming through the docks." The man at the head of the table nodded slightly. "Handle it," he replied calmly. Vicky stood there for a moment longer than she should have. The sugar bowl sat beside the cup. And just as she expected, his hand reached for it again. One spoon, then another. He stirred the espresso slowly. Vicky felt something inside her settle. The quiet doubt she had carried for days suddenly turned into certainty. She spoke before she could stop herself. "You added sugar again." The sound of her voice cut through the room. Conversations stopped. Several heads turned toward her. The man at the head of the table looked up slowly. "What did you say?" Vicky didn't move. The real Adriano Moretti never drinks sugar in his espresso. The silence that followed felt like it swallowed the entire dining hall. For a moment, no one reacted. Then one of the uncles frowned. "Vicky," he said carefully, "what are you talking about?" She turned slowly, looking around the table at the faces of the family members who had known her since she was a child. "I grew up in this house," she said quietly. "I've known Adriano since we were kids." The man at the head of the table leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing slightly. "You're overstepping," he said coldly. But Vicky didn't back down. Instead, she looked directly at him. The real Adriano used to say espresso should always be bitter. A few people exchanged uneasy glances. "And that's not the only thing," she continued. Her voice was steadier now. "When we were children, we used to sit on the back terrace of Maid and watch the city lights." The man said nothing. Vicky's eyes locked onto his. "You once told me that if I ever thought you'd changed too much, I should remind you about that night." The tension in the room tightened. And the real Adriano Moretti had once told her something no impostor could ever fake. Someone shifted in their chair. The man at the head of the table slowly set his spoon down. But Vicky wasn't finished. "There's one more thing." She reached into the pocket of her apron and pulled out a folded document. "My mother worked here the night Adriano was born," she said, "and I know the truth about what happened that night." Now the entire table was staring at her. Vicky lifted her chin. The Moretti family didn't lose a child that night. She pointed directly at the man sitting at the head of the table. Adriano Moretti had an identical twin. The words landed like a gunshot, and Vicky Johnson said the sentence that would change everything. "You're not Adriano Moretti. You're his brother." For several seconds, no one in the dining hall moved. The accusation hung in the air like something explosive waiting to go off. Every pair of eyes slowly shifted toward the man sitting at the head of the table. Some looked confused. Others looked angry. One of the older uncles slammed his hand against the table. "Vicky, have you lost your mind?" But she didn't look away from the man in the chair. not even for a second. The room waited. The man who looked exactly like Adriano Moretti stared at her in silence, his expression unreadable. For a moment, it almost seemed like he might laugh it off. Instead, something far more unsettling happened. He smiled. Not Adriano's calm, controlled smile. Something colder, something darker. "Well," he said quietly, leaning back in his chair, "this is interesting." A murmur spread across the table. One of the capos stood up halfway from his seat. "Don Adriano, say the word and we'll remove her." But the man raised a hand slightly. "No," he said. His eyes never left Vicky. "I think she deserves an answer." The silence deepened. Then he looked around the table slowly, studying the faces of the Moretti family, men who had followed Adriano for years. "You want the truth?" he said calmly. No one spoke. "Fine." He placed his hands on the table. "My name isn't Adriano Moretti." Gasps rippled through the room. One of the cousins pushed his chair back so abruptly it scraped loudly across the floor. "That's impossible!" The man shrugged slightly. "Not really." He looked back at Vicky. "She figured it out faster than I expected." The room felt like it had stopped breathing. "I'm Luca," he continued. "Luca Balotti." The name alone sent a wave of tension through the family. For decades, the Balotti family had been the Moretti's most bitter enemies. "You're lying," one of the uncles snapped. Luca chuckled softly. "Am I?" He leaned forward slightly. "Ask yourselves something. How would I know every detail of Adriano's life if I wasn't connected to him somehow?" No one answered, because the truth was beginning to settle in, slowly, painfully. Luca's eyes darkened. 35 years ago, he said, the Balotti family paid a midwife to steal one of the Moretti twins. A stunned silence fell across the table. Your precious Adriano had a brother. Me. One of the capos grabbed the edge of the table. "Where is Adriano?" For the first time, Luca's smile faded. "He's alive," he said. Vicky felt her breath catch, but not for long. Several men jumped to their feet. "What did you do with him?" Luca's voice was calm again. "I locked him somewhere safe while I finished taking his place." He glanced at Vicky again. "And once the family fully accepted me as Adriano Moretti, I was going to make sure he disappeared forever." The words sent a wave of shock through the room. The real Adriano Moretti wasn't dead. He was imprisoned somewhere, and the entire Mafia family had been sitting at dinner with the man who planned to erase him forever. The room erupted. Chairs slammed backward as several of the Moretti soldiers jumped to their feet, hands already reaching for the weapons hidden beneath their jackets. One of the capos moved quickly around the table, fury burning in his eyes as he grabbed Luca by the collar. "You're not leaving this room," he growled. Another man pulled out his phone. "Call the guards! Lock the gates! No one gets out!" Across the table, Adriano's uncle stood slowly, his face pale with anger. "You're going to tell us where he is," he said quietly. The entire dining hall felt like it was about to explode. But Luca Balotti didn't look afraid. He looked amused. Still seated at the head of the table, surrounded by men who would gladly tear him apart, he began to laugh. At first it was quiet, then louder. The sound echoed strangely against the high ceilings of the dining hall, sending an uneasy chill through the room. "Go ahead," Luca said finally, raising his hand slightly, as if inviting them to take him. "Capture me." Several soldiers moved closer, but the smile on his face never disappeared. "You should hurry," he added calmly. The uncle frowned. "Hurry?" Luca leaned back in the chair that had belonged to Adriano for years. "Yes." His eyes moved slowly around the room until they stopped on Vicky. "You're all wasting time." No one spoke. And then he said it. "You're too late. Adriano Moretti is already scheduled to die tonight." The words dropped into the room like a bomb. The capos froze. "What did you say?" one of them demanded. Luca's smile widened slightly. "I locked him away somewhere safe, far away from this house." One of the soldiers grabbed his collar tighter. "Where?" But Luca simply shrugged. "You really think I'd make it that easy?" The silence that followed felt heavier than the shouting before it, because slowly the truth began to settle over the entire room. Adriano Moretti was alive, but none of them knew where he was. None of them knew where Luca had hidden him. And somewhere out there in the darkness of New York, men loyal to Luca were already waiting for their orders. Orders to kill the real boss. Vicky felt her stomach drop as the realization hit her. The entire Moretti family had been sitting here arguing while time was slipping away. One of the capos turned toward the others, his voice suddenly tight. "Search every property Luca owns." Another man shook his head. "That could take hours." Vicky looked at Luca again. He was still smiling. And for the first time that night, the powerful Moretti family felt something they had not felt in a long time. Fear. Because the clock was already running out. And somewhere in the city, Adriano Moretti was waiting to die.
If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe. It really helps the channel grow and lets you know when new videos drop. Lastly, and turn on notifications so you never miss a video.